this is always a huge red flag for me. They kind of started with this, like, we talk about TV shows in the 80s and really anything else we want to do. Language like that tells listeners, you cannot expect anything consistent from this, that we're just going to take this wherever we want to go.
Right now, I think it just feels a little too generic, but there's something in that description that's getting to what is this show for, which is like, why does this matter now? It's not enough to just be a fan of the show and say we're going to talk about these old shows. It's just not enough.
Welcome back to another podcast roast, where in every episode we dissect one of our listeners' show's packaging to help them improve their discoverability and new listener acquisition, and help you do the same. And today on the skewer, we have 80s TV Ladies by Susan Lambert Hadham and Sharon Johnson. And Justin, as you pull up the listing here, what are your first impressions looking through the show's packaging?
All right, got it open in Apple Podcasts on the desktop, which, again, is not actually how most people are going to be consuming it. Most people are going to be consuming this on their phone, but this gives us a sense of what's going on here. So we got some vibrant cover art here. There's a television, 80s TV Ladies, kind of a pink TV, blue background. The title of the show is also 80s TV Ladies. Initial impressions, it's like, it seems fine. I think in this genre, I see a lot of shows about TV. And so I wouldn't say that the cover art especially stands out in terms of the competition. There's a lot of shows like this. And again, because I'm at Transistor, I see just thousands and thousands of shows in a specific genre. And so then I start to see the patterns. And I would say the cover art it's fine. It's actually reasonable, but I wouldn't say it really jumps out at me as like, oh, wow, like here's a unique take on this particular genre.
Yeah, that actually brings up a really interesting point that we can kind of get into in a second here. But my first impression is that it looks legitimate. Like, it looks like it's not just, amateur design or anything like that. So my sense is like, okay, it's probably going to be pretty good quality. 80s TV Ladies, kind of evocative. Like, you get a sense of probably what this is for. It doesn't tell you outright, but it kind of places you in the vicinity. And again, the TV imagery on the cover art kind of says like, okay, this is going to be a show about TV in some regard. 80s Ladies, probably you can start to put the pieces together there about that.
Mm-hmm.
But this is something that, you and I both, we have so much exposure to a lot of shows within almost any genre, but also shows as a whole. And so we are a little bit savvier than the average person of just like the breadth of what is out there and the trends that show up. And this is something that I think everybody should be doing that in their niche. And I think that what most people don't realize is that there are cliches that show up again and again and again. And a lot of times we might think like we're doing something original. And that's not to say that that's what's happening with this show, but you realize, oh, that shows up on 90% of the cover art in this niche. And so then it's not really a differentiating factor. And so what is it doing for you? And on the one hand, it kind of places somebody where they're like, okay, this is a show about TV shows or something like that in this instance. But if you're trying to attract people who are already looking for a show about TV shows and all of the cover art looks generally the same or has the same elements, you get lost in the noise a little bit. And so I know it's often uncomfortable for people to, go look at the competition, but I think that there is so much to be gained by understanding what is everybody doing here. And probably I don't actually want to do that. This is my list of things not to do almost to some extent, or to do them in a different way that I can actually stand out here.
Yeah. And I think we can even just do this right now. I've typed in 80s TV, and I would actually do this with your target audience if you can. Again, if you're hanging out with people at, I don't know, a meetup, or you just have friends that like 80s TV, then show them a bunch of cover art and say, hey, of all of these covers, which would you click on the first? And just see how often they choose yours.
Now, the other thing that is a little bit interesting about this, and so, you searched 80s TV here. I am not quite sure what a listener would search. If this is a show that somebody would search just TV podcasts, or would they search 80s TV? And so I'm not quite sure how somebody who's looking for a show like this would go about this. My assumption is that people are more likely to search for a specific show. And so my guess is that this show in particular has more potential SEO-wise for specific shows. So I'm assuming that they
Mm.
talk about different characters or actors from different 80s TV shows, and that those may be better entry points for a potential listener in this case. But there's also this other angle. I don't know if you know Caitlin Bourgoin, fellow Canadian.
Mhm,
She
mhm.
runs Customer Camp as her company. She runs a phenomenal newsletter called Why We Buy, and it's a lot of like customer psychology, sales psychology stuff. And she had this post on LinkedIn that it was this metal music festival poster. And if you're familiar with metal band logos, they're especially like death metal, they're like super
Mhm.
unreadable, like squirrely, tree branchy type fonts, and you can't tell anything. And
Yeah.
she used this as an example where like there was 30 bands and the every single one had this unreadable logo. And then there was one that was the name was something like Party Riot or something like that. And it was these like Toys R Us letters, basically. And she was like, this band gets it. Like they stand out. And at first I was like, that's really clever. But as I thought about it more, I thought about a context where, in this case, they are in their environment with like surrounded by all these other bands. But then I thought, if I'm walking down the street and there is a gig poster on the side of a building or on a telephone pole, if I see one of these squirrely metal music band logos, I don't need to read it. That immediately I'm like, oh, there's a metal band. And if I'm interested in metal music, now that's the signal like, oh, I should pay attention to this. Whereas maybe
Mhm.
a logo that stands out from typical metal bands, I would actually pass that by. And so I
Yeah.
think there's kind of like two sides to this where it's like, is this show, 80s TV Ladies, is it actually showing up being compared to other 80s TV show podcasts? Or is it showing up in a social feed where people are getting a whole bunch of stuff coming by them and seeing the TV iconography? If that's somebody who's into TV show podcasts, they're like, oh, this looks like something I might be interested in. So I could
Yeah.
take either side here on this, actually.
Yeah, and I think, again, this is where us not being maybe in the target market is a disadvantage. So, let's keep going here. I think,
Yep.
like we said, the cover art is definitely solid. There's still something about it. I think I'd like to see something a little bit more evocative, a little bit more unique, something that doesn't feel maybe so clip arty and so cliche. But let's read the description here and see how we feel. 80s TV Ladies is dedicated to the beloved female driven shows of the 1980s. So, right away, we get a nice thesis statement there.
Hmm.
Join hosts Susan Lambert Hadham and Sharon Johnson as they talk about the fabulous ladies of television: Cagney and Lacey, Designing Women, A Different World, The Golden Girls, and more. And then they've actually got quite a long description here. Love 80s pop culture, television, fabulous women. On our show, you'll hear a breakdown how these shows got made, how they were influenced by the times, and in turn, how they influenced pop culture trends to follow. We also love talking about the two-step forwards, one-step back lens of media-driven feminism. Okay. And then they actually list out some of their seasons here, like the episodes in season 1 and season 2. And then they've got a bunch of special guests listed as well. What kind of grade would you give the show description?
So I'll talk through some of the things that I like and that maybe I would tweak, and maybe we'll end up at a grade here. And so I I think the season 1 and season 2, this doesn't really make much sense to me, as if these are the only episodes, then it makes sense, like, you could just scroll back through the episodes, and maybe these aren't, like, maybe these are highlight episodes that maybe will draw people in, and so you know to look for these things. So if that's the case, I think that's actually a pretty good tactic, is giving people some, like, things that they're gonna recognize immediately and maybe be interested in, and now they know, "Okay, I'm gonna go back and look for this episode." So if that were the case, I would just say, like, season 1 highlights or, like, best starting points or something like that. Maybe that's a better way to go about it, and I think that that's actually really smart if that's the case, because my suspicion is that the most recent released episode of any podcast, it's almost impossible for that to be the best starting episode for almost anyone. Like, probably
Mhm.
the best entry point to a show, it's going to be somewhere in the back catalog, because like our most recent episode isn't always going to be like the best episode yet. Like, every single one is not going to be that way. And so I think that this could be a good tactic to help kind of get some easy hooks for people where they're like, oh, I'm a huge Star Trek fan. And so if I see that episode, now I know to go look for it. And that's going to give me the best first impression of the show. So
Mhm.
it's a little confusing here, but that might be what's going on. And I think that works. And potentially also this adds some more discoverability. Same with the special guests, add some discoverability. So I think that those are kind of like good tactical elements here. But I think
Mhm.
where I would workshop this a little bit is the first paragraph. where this feels to be very much about the show rather than what the show is for and what it would do for a
Mhm.
listener and why a listener would care. And so even like the first sentence, 80s TV ladies, is dedicated to the beloved female-driven shows of the 1980s. So
Mhm.
there are so many types of shows that could be. A show dedicated to the beloved female-driven shows of the 1980s. But what are we doing within that context here? And they do
Mhm.
talk about that later, where we also love talking about the 2 steps forward, 1 step back lens of media-driven feminism. So I get the
Mhm.
sense like that's not the main thrust of the show, but it is a kind of underlying piece. But I want to know a little bit like what's reel me in here off the first paragraph or two.
Yeah, I think there's elements of this third paragraph that would be better up top. This is quite common. I think I've even done this on my shows, is to say, join the hosts, whoever. But we actually have that information up here in the author tag. And so I don't think we need to reiterate it here unless you're super famous.
Hmm.
I think what you want to do is you want to say, who's the show for? Why should you care? What is our angle, our lens on this topic that is unique, that's not just the same old, that's gonna like inspire you to start picking up some episodes. And I
Yeah.
think there's elements of this third paragraph that have that, because it's like, let's hear a breakdown of how these shows got made. So instantly it's like, oh, that's interesting. Like when I think back on some of these old, like the Golden Girls, oh, it'd be interesting to hear like how that show got made, how they were influenced by the times, and in turn, how they influence pop culture trends to follow. Okay, it ignites my nostalgia. I remember those old shows, and you could almost ask those kinds of questions if you were curious about it. Like there could be a show called 1980s talk shows, and it's like hear about how Arsenio Hall got made, how it influenced pop culture at the time, how like okay, these are interesting hooks for anybody that is curious, has nostalgia. And then that last line is a little bit kind of even spicy, I'd say. Like,
Hmm.
we also want to talk about how some of these shows were 2 steps forward, 1 step back in terms of media-driven feminism. Okay,
Yeah.
wow, all right. That's a bit unique. That's not just two, fans of TV sitting and reminiscing about their favorite shows. This has actually got a more substantial point of view.
Yeah.
So I think elements of this third paragraph I would actually put up top because if I'm someone browsing for a show to listen to, I want to know like, is this for me? What's this about? What makes it unique? Why should I even give it a chance?
One of the things that I often think about is that like great shows are not about something, they're for something. And so I think
Mm,
identifying what that for is like, why does this need to exist? And maybe need is a strong word there, but like, what purpose does this have in the world? And I think that that can be something that is very listener facing. Like the show is doing something for a listener, but I think it can also be a lot of great shows start off with this like kind of unanswered question that the hosts want to get to the
mhm,
bottom of. And I think that this show I'm guessing there's an underlying question that gets Susan and Sharon interested in these old shows. Like, what's on their mind? And maybe some of these things are how did that get
mhm.
made and like how did they influence it? I think those are still surface level questions, that there's a deeper, maybe more philosophical question. And I,
Yeah.
I think actually finding what is that question and articulating that in the first line of this description would really pull me in and a lot more people.
Oh, I have a perfect example of this. You just hit it on the head because I think my worry with shows like this, and again, maybe it's influenced by the fact that I see a lot of them, is it's like, hey, do you love 80s TV? Yeah, I love 80s TV. Well, let's start a podcast and talk about 80s TV. And it's like, okay, but what's this show for? Like, what's underneath here? What's the big
Mhm.
underlying question? And a show that really illustrates this, that also deals with old media and also deals with nostalgia is this Jar Jar Binks show,
Oh,
um,
yeah.
The Redemption of Jar Jar Binks. So, here is a podcast about a movie that was made in the late 90s that many people remember, but right away, the redemption of Jar Jar Binks, you can tell there's something underneath here because if you grew up during that time, this character was very hated, was very controversial. Many people say this character ruined those movies. And now this character is going to be redeemed. It's similar to the lens of the show You're Wrong About.
Yeah.
So you take these old topics that people were like, it was like this, and of course everyone hated Jar Jar Binks. Everyone knows that. And then someone goes, "Well, there's been some time now. Maybe we should re-examine that." And
Yeah.
so there's a driving force in this show. There's something that's like pulling you in. Like, what's the unanswered question? Is like, wait a second, we're redeeming Jar Jar Binks. Like,
Yeah.
okay, like I gotta listen.
This calls an idea to mind to me. So, we're both big Seinfeld fans, and Seinfeld has in general aged pretty well, but there are
Hmm.
certain things that are kind of cringe at this point when you go back. And some of it's related
Yeah.
to like sexism or gender roles or things like that. Seinfeld was actually a very progressive show at the time, but now, 20, 30 years on, some of the things you realize, are a little bit dated and they're kind of out of step with current cultural kind of trends. And so, what
Hmm.
I think would be an interesting show, maybe for 80s TV ladies or someone else, is to say, let's look at these 80s female led TV shows, which were ahead of their time. They were progressive at the time. And let's actually apply a modern lens and see how far they showed us by looking back, how far we still had to go and how far things have
Hmm.
come and how we actually look at these and it was like, this was really progressive at the time. And it's like, wow, this is still so problematic in so many ways. Like there's a big juicy kind of question to look into that I think there's a lot to kind of extract from that.
And once you identify that central tension, I think then it informs everything else. It informs how you're going to do your cover art. It informs how you're going to do your title, your everything. And so right now, I think some of what I'm picking up is it just feels a little too generic, but there's something in that description that's getting to what is this show for, which
Hmm.
is like, why does this matter now? Like,
Yeah.
why should we talk about 80s TV now? Why does it matter? And it's not enough to just be a fan of the show and say we're going to talk about these old shows. It's just not enough to stand out. You really need this other element. And so, if this is about how these old female driven shows influenced feminism and how it brought it forward today, maybe you could have a split cover art with like an old 80s TV setting and then, it evolving to a modern scene or something like that,
Hmm.
contrasting both the past and the present.
That's another great concept idea, actually, of like tracing the roots of something in today back to 80s female led television shows. Everybody loves like the hidden backstory. And if you then anchor it in 80s TV, it's like that's a fascinating lens to take to a show.
And this doesn't have to be too complicated. We're suggesting different things here, but the setup can be really simple, which is just like, here's what you didn't know about those shows.
Hmm.
Like that's the setup. It's like you
Yeah.
loved those shows, like we love those shows too, but we could just talk about what we loved about the show. But what's really interesting, here's what you didn't know about the Golden Girls, right? Here's what was going on behind the scenes. It's like the show you're wrong about. It's going back and saying, here's what you didn't know about what was happening in the past. I think that's also a great setup that could work.
I think the one thing that's worth kind of pointing out here is that when you're talking about something that has happened historically in the past, there's always going to be some level of people who are just appreciators of that thing. Like they're just huge fans of that era of TV, or we did the history of the Germans before. And so that was this
Hmm.
kind of like historical history of Germany. And if you're interested in history, you're going to appreciate that. But I think shows that have much more mainstream appeal, they are rooted in some way in the present because that provides this additional layer of relevance to people. And so everybody's trying to make sense of life all around them every day. And part of that can be through some kind of like escapism or entertainment. And so you can take this kind of thing and say, like, hey, let's re examine 80s TV, but we're going to show you how it applies to your life today. That's this additional
Hmm.
hook that people can now see. I almost think there's some kind of like mental justification of like, what am I going to spend my time on? Yeah, maybe am I going to listen to a show about 80s TV? Like, I like 80s TV, but like, there's probably something more relevant to me. But then if there's something that's going to actually make me smarter about the world we live in now or spot some kind of unseen connections, like, I think that provides more pull to listen to the show. And so relevance and context in people's lives today is an important thing to kind of make clear in your messaging and packaging.
It's something else we've talked about in the past, which I think is illustrates this idea of what draws people in is Dana Carvey and David Spade had the show Fly on the Wall. And at first it was very popular, top of the charts, getting lots of downloads. And I think what was drawing people in was they were interviewing a lot of people about Saturday Night Live, and you were getting this behind the scenes look at Saturday Night Live. So that's what was driving people to the show, is like, give me those juicy bits that have never been talked about behind the scenes on SNL. And they've tried to do other like interviews, and it's not as much in their wheelhouse. And I think they've kind of lost some of that initial drive that people had, which is, I just want to know all those old stories. I just want to hear you chatting with other cast members about the good old days and hearing all the things that we never knew when we were teenagers up watching the show.
Yeah.
So I'm glad we got on this, because I think figuring out what is driving listeners to a show is so important. And you can also get this information just by talking to podcast listeners and say, hey, what drove you to the show? What was interesting about the show? I think Conan O'Brien Needs a Friend also had a similar dynamic where he was very top of the charts for a long time, because it was like, oh, Conan's talking to all the old buddies from the old days, you know? And that was really interesting and exciting. And then once he kind of ran out of his old buddies, it was like not as fun anymore, at least for me and other people I've talked to.
Yeah. I think that's where like some shows that have a great concept that they're built around, they're not heavily reliant on the guests, or like it's almost like a gimmick a little bit, where you kind of exhaust your premise early on within the first 20 episodes. And then it's like, well, like maybe it's been a little bit successful. You got some traction. You're like, well, what do we do now? And even, you know, this is one of my potential concerns with a show like this, is how many women-led TV shows from the 80s are there? How much real estate do they have? And that's something that I always like think about a lot of times with different shows that I'm thinking about starting, is like, is this a ongoing show that will run, you know, conceivably forever? Or is this something that is best served as a 10-episode series, and I can do a really dense, high-value 10 episodes, and then I move on to another project? And so, you know, looks like they've had a number of episodes already here. It looks like they're at maybe 59 episodes. Seems like they're still going strong, but I always do wonder about that at some point you can exhaust your premise, and you might need to either expand, or sometimes it's just the right decision to say, okay, this show had a good run and we can't really keep going with this, and so maybe we start something new off the back of this.
Yeah. All right. We could get into episode titles and show art, but I think it's time to listen to the trailer. You scroll down in Apple Podcasts, you see it right there in the trailer section. This is also, if you scroll down in the app, that's where the trailer is in Apple Podcasts. And over here on Spotify, on the web, we have the trailer on the right. So let's give this a listen. You ready for this?
Let's do it.
3, 2, 1, play.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our brand new podcast, 80s TV Ladies. This is a special pop culture podcast where we take you on a journey to the fabulous, exciting, female-driven television past. I'm Susan Lambert Hadham.
And I'm Sharon Johnson, Susan's co-pilot. On 80s TV Ladies, we'll be examining beloved female-driven TV shows of the 1980s.
With some sidebars to the 70s and 90s, and really, frankly, wherever we want to go.
But mostly, we'll be talking about that special time, 1980 through 1989, when television was big hair, big shoulder pads, and 3 big networks. Please join us.
All right.
Okay. Here's what I'm curious about. Can I actually just listen to the first minute of their most recent episode?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. 3, 2, 1.
It is Ryan here, and I have a question for you. What do you do when you win? Like, are you
Okay,
a
just got
fist
an ad.
pumper? A
Me too.
woo-hooer,
In
a hand
Spanish.
clapper, a high fiver? I kind of like the high five, but if you want to hone in on those winning moves, check out Chumba Casino. At ChumbaCasino.com,
I got a
choose
Canadian
from
ad.
hundreds of social casino-style games for your chance to redeem serious cash prizes. There are new game releases weekly, plus free daily bonuses. So don't wait. Start having the most fun ever at ChumbaCasino.com.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void were prohibited by law. See terms and conditions. 18
Okay.
plus.
I was quite set on theater. I was going to go out to Los Angeles for 1 year, and that was it. I was going to go back to New York and devote myself to the theater. Didn't work out that way.
Welcome to 80s TV Ladies with your fabulous hosts, Sharon Johnson and Susan Lambert Hadham.
Hello, I'm Sharon.
And I'm Susan. I am always fascinated to learn about female directors, especially female directors who started in the 80s. So our next guest is part of our ongoing Director Ladies
Okay,
series.
that's good. I kind of got what I needed there. Okay, so here's what I'll say. Their most recent episode, they have their full theme song played. The theme song is fabulous. I love it.
Yeah.
They come right in. They sound professional, confident. Their microphones sound good. Really like their intro on their most recent episode. Their trailer episode does not sound as good. The microphone quality is not there. The editing's not quite tight. I like that little stinger they have of 80s TV Ladies. I like that part. But as soon as it gets into them on the mics, it feels like, oh, this was probably recorded at the beginning of the show when they had less experience.
Mhm.
And when I listen to the most recent episode, I get, oh, professional, poise, better quality mics, better mic technique. I think they should re-record that trailer episode and really tighten it up.
Yeah, I noticed the same thing. And the other thing that I noticed that this is always a huge red flag for me, and I suspect that it is for listeners as well, is they kind of started with this, like, we talk about TV shows in the 80s and also the 70s and also the 90s. That's still fine. But then they said, and really anything else we want to do. That is the red flag to me. And you see it so often on so many shows where it says, we talk about this, but also we just talk about whatever we want to. And if I see that, I'm like, this is not a serious show. And so this might be a serious show, but language like that tells listeners, you cannot expect anything consistent from this, that we're just going to take this wherever we want to go. And sometimes you're going to get this, sometimes you're going to get that. And there are so many podcasts that is the whole premise, that it's just like, whatever I want to talk about. And it's like, you cannot expect to have any listeners when you're telling people there is no consistency of what we're going to deliver to you. It's just like, whatever I feel like talking about today. And it's like, well, who are you? If even Conan starts off hot and then kind of, drops down after he exhausts all of his big guests, it's like, if people are even dropping off listening to Conan, like somebody who's just started a podcast that nobody knows about, like, they're not coming in to tune into you sharing your thoughts on whatever's top of mind for you that day. And so that's not necessarily what they're doing here. But whenever I see any hint of that language, I would remove that, and I would keep this tight and focused. And this is what we do. This is why we do it. This is what you can expect. And so somebody can sign up to that and say, yes, that sounds like something I'm interested in. And maybe you do a bit of meandering here and there, but I wouldn't advertise that out front.
Yeah. And their theme song actually has great elements to it. I don't know who did it for them, but it's really fabulous. There's this idea of being a woman in a man's world. I think there's some of these dynamics that I would like to see more in the description, more in the cover art, more in the original trailer. You could explore that concept episode after episode, and it sounds like they're interviewing like directors and other things from that time. Well, what a great spicy topic, which is like, the 80s were kind of like a man's world. And so how did the TV of the time affect where we got to now? How did the people working in television at the time feel? Like, we could explore all these dynamics that I think would be really interesting.
So should we move on to the titles next here?
Yeah, let's look at titles and episode cover art. So 80s TV Ladies, you get some kudos from Jeremy and I for having custom episode art. And let's talk about how these elements kind of interact with each other. As we scroll through these episodes, what's jumping out at you?
So I see there's a couple of recent episodes. So nominated for Best Indie Podcast, help us win a Webby Award. Okay, so that's just more of a kind of listener-facing, ask for help episode, which I actually like this. I think of these as like announcement episodes. And so this one is, 2.5 minutes long. And I think it's totally fine. Like, if you built up an audience, this is one more touch point that you have to be able to get people to, take some action that you were asking of them. And so I highly recommend doing this kind of stuff. And as a new listener, this doesn't, turn me off in any way. I'll just skip that episode if I'm not a longtime listener. But if I am a listener, I'm like, okay, 2 minutes and 25 seconds. Happy to listen to that, hear what's going on, hear an update, and maybe vote for them to win a Webby Award. I see the episode above that is Welcome New Listeners. So they've got a couple, like maybe there's a bunch of new people coming in. They got some exposure through the Webbies, something like that. So they're kind of addressing those people. But then if we keep scrolling, I think we're going to get into more of the kind of standard titling structure and episode structure. And so it looks like there is potentially, is this another show or a sub show type of these moonlighting? Our top 8 favorite episodes, or is Moonlighting the 90s TV Babies, Moonlighting Magic, the making of Moonlighting? So this looks like they've done a series on moonlighting here that they've dedicated a bunch of episodes to here. But then it's a little bit strange to me that there is a encore that breaks up that flow of episodes here. Revisit Cagney and Lacey with Sharon Gless. So that's, I mean, a little bit odd. I might remove that one actually after the fact, given the fact that it's also looks like a rebroadcast, and so that whole series is together. But I think the thing that stands out to me is really what is going to draw somebody into these episodes are either the actors who are in the shows or the name of the show. And so I think you kind of almost don't want to get too much in the way of those. Like that needs to be clear. But I think that some of these could be sharpened up a little bit in terms of like Moonlighting Magic. That's a little bit of a very vague title that's like, okay, we know it's about the show, but what is this episode about specifically in the context of this larger series? So those are some kind of initial things that stand out to me from looking through these. What about for yourself?
Yeah, so this looks like an interview with somebody who worked on the show, post-production supervisor, Moonlighting. You've got to figure out the hook. You got to figure out the hook. And so you know your audience better than Jeremy and I know your audience. Here's my intuition, though. My intuition is that most folks do not know the name Cheryl Maine. And so you've got to figure out with your title, what did Cheryl Maine bring to this episode that was like, wow, or I didn't know that, or here's the thing that everybody needs to know. What could you tease in the episode title or the episode cover art or the first line of the description that might bring somebody in? And they do have a quote from Cheryl here at the beginning, but it doesn't quite draw me in. And so I think there's an opportunity here to really bring in at least one of these topics that might draw somebody in and go, okay, there's something spicy in this episode that I've got to listen to because I'm already interested in either the show or what it was like to work in TV in the 80s as a woman, or I'm just interested in, I grew up in the 80s and I'm a feminist and I want to know, what can we take from that time that's brought us here? Figure out that tension, and then you're just teasing what's coming. Like, here's why you should click play on this episode.
One of the things that I often advise people on, and this is something that's very common in YouTube, and actually I say very common, but it's more common in the top tier YouTubers, is they will not even create a video if they don't already know the title and have a hooky title for it. And so they'll talk about both often like the title and the thumbnail. And they'll be like, if we can't package this well, it's just not worth even doing because we can't get somebody to click in it. And so a lot of times it's coming up with the title ahead of time and being like, oh, this is a great hook for an episode. And so if we know we're talking to this person and we're like, oh, it would be really cool if we got them to talk about this and we got to see, these anecdotes from behind the scenes, and we already have a title that's got a great hook to it. You've built the box and now you kind of need to fill it with the interview. And so you kind of know where you want to take it and you already know what that hook is. And so one of the challenges that I think a lot of shows run into is that they're really focused on the guest and they're like, this guest is really interesting. Who knows what we're going to talk about? And what inevitably happens is you talk about a whole bunch of stuff and now you're like, what do I title this thing? Because we talked about 6 different things over the course of an hour. And so the overarching episode isn't really focused on one thing in particular. And so now you're just like, well, do I take whatever the most interesting thing is and I just title it with that, which makes sense because you're supposed to title it with, a good hook. And the problem, though, is that then that essentially becomes clickbait because the reason somebody clicked in was to get whatever was promised in the title. But maybe that doesn't show up until 45 minutes into the episode and it's only a 5 or 10 minute segment. And now they kind of feel cheated. And so you can have the title from the start and maybe you don't actually get that thing that you were hoping for, but at least you had something that you were shooting for from the beginning. And if something better comes along, you can retitle it with an equally hooky title, hopefully. Or if it doesn't, it's like, okay, well, we're going to have to pick something for this episode. It didn't quite go to plan, but you increase your chances of coming up with a hooky episode as a whole when you start out with, this is a title that people would click on. How do we make that episode?
So let's just play with some titles here. What about this? A director sent me home for wearing pink jeans. We're getting a little bit long here, but so this could either be the title or the first line of the description. I think using quotes in your titles is actually underrated. It's just like, it signals so much. Like, this is an interview. We get a director. So it's like, okay, we know this is about TV or movies or something. Sent me home for wearing pink jeans. It's like, oh yeah, that's like, and I just read that in this description down here. That's at least a spicy, curiosity-inducing hook that does get to some of the main points of the episode and the show. And there's some mystery there. Like, a director sent you home for wearing pink jeans, you know? It introduces all of these dynamics that I think kind of fit this show. And this might require a second set of eyes. I think we get into this habit of producing a podcast is so much work. And so I do this too. It's like, if I'm making an episode, I get into this part here where I'm like, okay, I got to think of a title. Like, what was this episode?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll just title it like Chatting with John. Okay, I'll come back to that. Upload the episode. Oh, I need episode cover art. Okay, I'll find that. Okay, I need a quote. What do I remember from the episode? Okay, they talked about this, da-da-da-da. And I get it. Like, you're just trying to get the episode out or scheduled. And the key, I think, is to sometimes get someone to have a second look at it. Maybe someone who's not involved in the show. And I think sometimes we can partner with our fans on this. Like, there might be a group of fans that you could start a Discord or a Slack group with. It's just like 5 people, like the 5 insiders. And before you publish an episode, you just say, hey, how can we make this title better and this episode description better?
Yeah. And I think the other thing that we have, like, varying levels of energy and enthusiasm for different parts of the process. Usually before the episode, we have more energy and enthusiasm for it before we actually record it. And so I think that that's actually a good time to start brainstorming title ideas. And maybe you don't actually use any of those, but you've got a bunch of stuff that's like, these would all be really interesting titles. And maybe I can kind of mold the episode to fit one of these. But at least you've got some kind of brain dumping done early on that will also help you with your questions, versus at the end where you're just like, I just want to get this out there. I don't really care about the title. Whatever, I'll do better next episode. And I think that that's the cycle that we so often get into.
All right, and let's take a look at the reviews for the show. It looks like 52 reviews total in Apple Podcasts. First of all, well done getting reviews. It's good social proof. They also had quite a few reviews in Spotify, I believe. 18 reviews, 4.8 stars. You know, that looks good. It's worth getting your fans to leave reviews. I also am interested in, you know, what is drawing people to the show? How are they listening to the show? And we get some clues to that in these first few reviews. I just found 2 new best friends. Okay, so there's a job to be done there, right? For this particular listener, these 2 hosts feel like great friends, and we're talking about old TV shows. Enjoyed my first episode of 80s TV Ladies while cleaning up the other day. So we get a sense of what people are doing while they're listening to the show. Fun banter. I really enjoy the podcast. As a huge Remington Steele fan, I've especially loved the Steele episodes. So now we're getting a sense of maybe some entry points, how people are coming to the show. These are all clues here on how people find the show, why they listen to the show, what brings them back, and even what they're doing while they're listening to the show.
I love looking through some of these. There's also some recommendations. And so there's one here that says, keep up the good work. Please cover Designing Women, Roseanne, and A Different World, 3 of my absolute faves. And so that's great. I think this is something you can encourage as a way to incentivize reviews, is get people to, you know, leave the show that you would love us to cover, do a series on in future episodes. And that can kind of be a prompt that will get people to leave a review in the first place as well.
Yeah. Anything else we should talk about before we leave 80s TV Ladies?
So the last thing we didn't really touch on here was we listened to the trailer and then we listen to the first minute of the most recent episode. And I know that you and I both got, some very different ads, but we both got a series of ads. And so I'm in Spain, and so I got, I think, 3 in a row Spanish language podcasts. One was for a mobile company. I don't know what the other 2 were for. And I know that you got some ads, some Canadian ads as well. So they're doing some geo-targeting ads here that are being programmatically inserted. And this is just another one of those things where we've talked about this in previous episodes, where if growth of the show is the goal, then I would remove all friction to a new listener falling in love with the show. And so if you're already doing, tens of thousands of downloads an episode and you're in like cashing in mode, great. Use the ads. You've got a big audience and like that's kind of what you built it for. But if you're still in growth mode, unless there was a meaningful amount of income coming in from these ads, personally, I would at the very least move those to mid-roll or post-roll, if not kind of get rid of them entirely. So that was my first impression of the show, was these kind of loud ads, and it was quite a few of them before we actually got to anything about the episode. And so that's kind of my 2 cents and philosophy on that.
And I think, again, there's all sorts of reasons to run a pre-roll ad. It is the most valuable spot. It's the one that advertisers want. I think having your own pre-roll before the pre-roll is another technique. Just give us a sense of who the hosts are. Give me a sense of, does this show have good audio quality or bad audio quality? It could be 10 seconds. Hey, folks, we got a great interview today talking with somebody who directed on this show. We'll be right back after a few ads, and then go into the ads, because that initial experience, especially if you're just letting some commercial dictate the initial impression of the show, it'd be nice to have a bit more control over that and ease people into the show. It can be 5-second, 10-second intro, and then run the ads.
Yeah. Other than that, though, I think that they've got a lot of good elements here. It sounds to me from the teaser and the description like there's a seed of something that can be further kind of brought to light here, that there's a strong foundation for the show. Maybe that just requires some kind of honing of the messaging, and maybe that also requires some tweaking of the shows. Maybe they love the show that they're doing and they can ignore all of our advice altogether. But solid number of reviews in both Spotify and Apple. And also they've been nominated for a Webby Award. So certainly some kind of positive signals here from what I'm seeing. And I know that I think both Susan and Sharon have been fans and followers of our show for a while now. So very glad to be able to submit them to the skewer for the roast.
Yes. Thanks for this submission. If you would like to submit your show for consideration for a future roast, search for our podcast, Podcast Marketing Trends Explained, in Apple Podcasts. Leave us a review and mention the name of your show. That all goes into a hat, and we pick out a name at random, and you could be on the skewer for a future episode.